half of my book does address the evangelical argument. And there are a lot of folks in those denominations that are having to address this, and it's more difficult for some of them, I think.
Can you mention some of the evangelical arguments and how maybe they differ from the Catholic arguments on women ordination?
Yeah, that's a crucial issue that many people are not aware of this. And I became familiar with it only because I was raised in evangelical, then did my graduate work at all Roman Catholic places. Interestingly enough, when I was doing my doctoral work, this was still very much in the air among Roman Catholics. The Vatican had not yet officially put the hammer down or said no more discussion. But the Catholic theologians that I knew were intended to be in favor of women's ordination. And in fact, I interact with one at great length in my book, whom I studied under at the University of Notre Dame. But the main difference, and again, there's a kind of unawareness of this, is that the Roman Catholic, Anglo-Catholic, High Church arguments against women's ordination are very different from the evangelical arguments. So the evangelical arguments against women's ordination focus primarily on a few passages in the Apostle Paul, particularly Ephesians chapter 5, when Paul is talking about relationships between men and women in the family, and he uses the word head to talk about the husband, and then a discussion about head coverings in 1 Corinthians 10, where Paul again uses that word head, and then the passage in 1 Timothy, where Paul says in simply one sentence, the translation of which is controversial, but I'll just translate it as, I'm not allowing women to teach and or exercise authority. And so it's really, for evangelicals, it has been these three passages in Pauline, the Pauline epistles. What is found and read from these passages is then read into other parts of the New Testament, the Old Testament. So, for example, Genesis 1 and 2, creation of man and woman, that is interpreted to mean that because Adam, the man, was created first, that he has authority over the woman. And then it's pointed out that Jesus, for example, had male apostles. But it's really these Pauline passages that are driving the exegesis. In Roman Catholic theology, a major shift took place around the time of Vatican II, which led to radically different understandings of the relationship between men and women. And the Catholic Church abandoned any notion of the inferiority of women or that there is a hierarchical ordering of women. And in fact, John Paul II, in what's called his theology of the body, has discussions about marriage in which he basically advocated what would be an egalitarian reading of Ephesians 5, saying that the submission in that passage is about mutual submission of husbands and wives to one another. So the Catholic argument is not focused in authority, which is where the Protestant argument is. It is focused in sacramental theology, and particularly the notion that when the priest is celebrating communion, he speaks in what's called in persona Christi, in the person of Christ. And this goes back to discussion in Thomas Aquinas, when Aquinas is talking about what is essential for this celebration of a sacrament. And Aquinas, using Aristotelian language, uses two different, a distinction between what's called form and matter. He says the form of the sacrament is the words. So in baptism, the form of the sacrament is, I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The matter of the sacrament is the water. So if you have the form, the words, and the water, and the intention of the person baptizing the priest to do this in the name of the church, the baptism is valid. Aquinas then looks at the Eucharist and says, well, what is the form? What are the words? He says the words are the words of institution. Jesus says, this is my body, this is my blood, and the matter is the bread and wine. And so when the priest says those words, he is speaking, Aquinas' expression, in persona Christi, in the person of Christ. And that's what you need for a valid sacrament. And that's all Aquinas says about it. It's just sort of like, and then he goes on to talk about other things. But what has happened in the modern period is that notion of in persona Christi was interpreted in an encyclical that was endorsed by Pope Paul VI called Inter Insigniores, to mean that because the priest speaks in persona Christi, in the person of Christ, that the priest must physically resemble Christ, and therefore the priest must be a man. So that's where the difference is between the two positions. One is focusing on liturgy, sacraments, and what is the priest or the pastor doing. And that's also the Lutheran theology, that the pastor is speaking in the person of Christ. The evangelical focus is on authority, and not, especially in churches that are very sacramentally low church, they're not particularly concerned about sacramental theology in that way.
That's a really fascinating way that those two different approaches are taken to this issue. I never even heard the Roman Catholic viewpoint you just expressed. That's very fascinating, the sacramental theological approach.
Right, yeah, and that's, and again, I think it's interesting that Protestants and Catholics who are opposed to the ordination of women recognize, well, there are some Protestants who are opposed to the ordination of women, evangelicals realize Catholics, but they don't understand or recognize that they're for very different reasons. So I've had discussions with evangelicals in my own church. Often there's a distinction between high church and low church, evangelical Anglicans or Anglo-Catholic Anglicans. And I've had evangelical Anglicans try to disagree with me about the Catholic position. And I said, well, I studied at Roman Catholic Seminary. I know the position. Roman Catholics don't mind, for example, having women theologians teaching in seminaries. Evangelicals, at least presumably, who don't believe in the ordination of women, at least if they're following people like Wayne Grudem, the man who's written the most material in this area, does not believe that women are allowed to teach in seminaries. Although there are many evangelical seminaries, places like Wheaton, where women do teach. But I think Wheaton generally, places like Wheaton would be more open to the ordination of women. So yeah, so those are the major differences.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out this video clip from the Delgado Podcast. To get more videos like this, simply subscribe here on YouTube. You can also download the full episode of each show on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or your favorite podcast player. Take care.